should download your videos, and they seem to have caught on or changed how they've done that. So that's why the video from the lecture yesterday is not up. Luckily, we have a backup plan, and yeah, so we shouldn't have any problems with this video, but it might take a second to get the last one. We will see. Okay, I'll just go ahead and get started. It seems like everybody's here. Everyone who RSVP'd is here. Oops. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can anybody let me know if this is too small? Do we need to make it bigger? What's the verdict on my screen share?
I would say the terminal probably needs to be bigger.
Bigger?
But everything else looks pretty good.
All right. So, picking up where we left off yesterday, remember we are going through the RESTful routing conventions. We are taking kind of the 5 RESTful routing conventions, or the app design paradigm that in general people want to see every instance of a model. They want to see specific instances of a model. They want to create a new instance of a model. They want to edit an instance of a model, and they want to delete an instance of a model. There are corresponding HTTP verbs, routes, and views for each of these tasks. I've kind of laid them out right here. We're following along with this RESTful routing slideshow. The point of the slideshow really, I think, is the kind of dynamic between the person who's at the restaurant, the customer, the client, the waiter who is kind of behaving as the controller, and then the chef who is kind of behaving as the model. And then we are continuing with our spellcaster application and building out spells. So far we have the logic built out to demonstrate all instances of our spells and to demonstrate a particular instance of our spell. And then the next thing we're going to do is talk about creating a single spell. So if we're continuing from yesterday, we were determined that if we want to see a specific sushi, right, we have the HTTP verb get, which corresponds with the URL or URI sushi's ID. The controller method is kind of just like a mashup of those two, right? And then we determine which view the user sees or whether we redirect. So following that storyline, the user says, I want a salmon roll. So in the view, they are essentially to click on the salmon roll from the index page, give it to the controller goes to the model prepares or finds the specific roll that the user requested, and then the controller returns that, the model takes that instance, gives it to the controller, and then the controller returns it to the user in the view. And the way that we have seen that in our application so far is, as this, right? Why isn't my forward slash working? There we go. Okay. So we're seeing our spells, we're picking one, right? We create a specific URL based on the ID of the object that we picked. In my view, dynamically used this iterator to create the links that correspond with the specific spell. And then once we do that, our application reads that this is the route in the controller with the corresponding HTTP verb. It finds the spell based on the ID parameters, saves it to an instance, renders the show, the ERB, the view, and then we can use the instance variable to render the specific information that we want. Are there any questions before we get going? Before we continue? All right. So this has been accomplished. The user says, I actually forgot I'm allergic to cinnamon. Can I make my own? So now we're getting to create our own instances of something, right? So what would be the HTTP verb to provide the user with a view that shows them a form of how to create, or allowing them to create their own instance of a model? Which is the HTTP verb? We're trying to answer this question first. Any takers? All right, we've got post, we've got get. Wale says get as well. The answer is actually get, because at this point in time, we're actually only just showing the user a form. The form is just ERB, right? There's no creating quite happening yet. We're just giving them an HTML form for them to input data. Does anyone know what the URI would be, or what URI URL would be? Right, for the purposes of this application, it's spells/new. And of course, like I said before, kind of just combine those two together to get the method in our controller. Is there a view user? Which view in particular does the user get to see?
Like, you need to see the form to create the new sushi with all the details.
Right. So which ERB file is that going to be?
ERB new.erb, stuff like that.
Exactly. ERB spells new. Is there any other logic that I need to include in here?
This is for him to create the new sushi, yes?
Well, this is just showing them the form to create the new sushi.
Okay, so I'm not sure, to be honest.
This is showing.
But if
actually,
if it's rendering the ERB spells new, shouldn't the form be on the view now?
Exactly. Yeah. So at this moment in time, there isn't really any other logic that we need to include in here.
Yeah.
We just want the user to see a form.
Yes, and then when the user see the forms on the view thing, you want the post verb to actually create and save or whatever. Yes.
Right. Why is this? Here we go. So we'll create a new .erb form. All right. So that's exactly right. We want to be able to type in spell/new, and then here see a form that allows us to create a spell. All right. So for those of you who aren't familiar with HTML and are learning HTML along the way, I would encourage you to check out those bonus sections on HTML if you haven't yet. Save some time by the end of the week before you start your project. But it's okay if you don't feel comfortable using HTML yet and you're just learning on a case-by-case basis, especially with Sinatra. So let's see here. I'm just going to add some fun titles, create a new spell, or maybe add a new spell to your spell book, maybe. And then we're just going to use a form here. I just switched to a different computer and it has this automatic thing going on. Okay. So in the form is asking, where do you want me to send this information to, and what method do you want me to use? Okay. We already know, well, we should know that the post method, the post HTTP verb, corresponds with when we're submitting information to send something. So this is fine. We can leave that. What is the action going to be? In other words, which route are we going to use to send this information to? Where do we want to send this information? It's kind of a tricky question. I don't think that we've quite reviewed this yet.
Is it the same as the... Can you open the application controller again? Or the spells controller, sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, do we want to send to this spells new thing?
No, spells new, a get request to spells new, right, is just going to show the form. But I think a point that you're pointing out here that I think is interesting, something that you're catching on to, is that we can use the same URLs, but with different HTTP verbs in front of them, right? So I see in the chat that Jesse is saying that we need to send a post request to spells. Alex is asking, do you have a post route? And then, let's see. And then spells ID, spells you just made. No, the answer really is that we do want to make a request to, and I'm kind of giving this next part away. But the post request that we're actually going to be sending, the URL that we're going to be sending the post request to is actually /spells. So you'll notice here that I have spells used twice. However, in the first case, I have get spells, which is the AP verb get. And Sinatra reads that get is the HTTP verb with the URL spells. It's gonna execute this information. But when it sees that the HTTP verb is post and this is the URL, we can reuse. This is the convention to use this URL as where we're sending our post request to, and have the logic end up here. So in our form, we are going to make the request to /spells. Are there any questions about that?
I guess for each view, is it convention? Is it convention to put all the all the gets routes first and then kind of do posts under that, or is it just doesn't really matter?
You'll see here in a second that the order depends on something. I mean, I think in general we want, well, again, the important thing to remember is that our controller reads routes from top to bottom. It compares these things from top to bottom. And as we'll see in a second, I'll kind of just show you now because you're catching onto it, but I want to be able to go spell /new, right? And this error here, it says we couldn't find a spell with the ID of new. Remember that this is a wildcard. Sinatra interprets this as a wildcard. So as we're making this request and we're going top to bottom in the controller, it's saying get request to spells. No, that's not quite it. Get request to spells /ID. Well, if this is a wildcard, then new kind of slips into that category, right? This route kind of gets away with matching with this one because the second kind of part to this URL here is, like I said, like a wildcard, right? So it's most important to put the URLs that are extremely specific, right? /new is a very specific URL, more so than /:ID because this is the variable, right? So I should actually put this URL above this one. So although I'm trying to go in a specific order to show you, the most kind of important thing is just are they in an order where that when read from top to bottom, a controller is going to be able to match the correct HTTP and route with the method that we want to use. Right? otherwise, I think that it's kind of up to you to determine how you want to do it. Does that make sense, Nelson? Okay.
Yeah.
So, for sure. All right. So then I want to make some labels here because we have a name for a spell that we want to do, that we want to input, and then I also want a description of what the spell does, right? And we'll put some line breaks here. How did you do that? And here I'll say, we'll just use the input tag. The type is text. And then I want to talk about naming our inputs really quickly. We can, I'll dive in a little bit more into the difference of each of these, but when we put the information inside here, so the name essentially of an input is what the column name is. So if we are typing in the name of a spell, then the name field of the input is going to be the name because we have a name column in our spells table. Same thing with description. We have an input type as text. The name is going to be description. However, when we're creating instances of something, you and I both know that this information is going towards creating an instance of the spell, right? Both of these pieces of information are crucial to creating an instance of the spell. So we can do something where we kind of like namespace or nest our parameters, and we do so by putting the name of the object in front here and putting the column name inside of these brackets. But I will leave this here for now and demonstrate what this looks like without nesting the parameters versus what it looks like when we do nest our parameters. And then I'll add a couple more breaks, and then I'll have an input, which is type of submit, and then the value here will be make a spell. And let's see what this looks like. Okay, cool. So we have our basic form. It's important to remember that all of the information that goes towards making a form needs to be inside of the form tags. And then we have the labels, right? I didn't put any breaks in between the labels, so although I did a line break, it ends up right next to it. And then if we use our Google HTML inspector, let's see, why isn't this working? We can kind of click this and, oops. I mean, we wrote this HTML, so it's going to be pretty straightforward, but I would encourage you to, especially when we get into Rails, continue to look at, observe how your HTML is changing, because we're going to be using what are called form helpers later on in the future in Rails that are going to do a lot of the form writing for us. But for now, we're going to be working on writing the majority of our forms from scratch. All right, and then just to make sure that I'm hitting the controller correctly, I'm just going to put a binding.pry in here. One thing that I wanted to mention yesterday but forgot to is that you can absolutely use binding pry inside RB. So earlier today, before we started this lecture, I was trying to render this page. I forgot that I had made some changes after the lecture yesterday, and my page wasn't rendering correctly, and I wasn't quite sure why. You can use the bracket, we call these ice cream cones. And then, well, I've always called them ice cream cones, and then if you have this, I call it a squid. You can use the ice cream cones to put a binding.pry to iterate, and then this will create a pry session when you try to visit this view. So if you're ever trying to use ERB and something's not rendering correctly because of an iterator or any other type of logic that you're trying to do, feel free to just throw a binding pry in there. That should work.
Chris, I have a silly question here real quick. On the forms, is there any benefit of using the label tag instead of just like writing name? We are in ERP, I think everything right there would just, if you don't put the label, you just put like name and then the input tag for the text.
For the purposes of now, no. Again, as we move forward and we start using form helpers, you'll start seeing that there are, you'll start seeing that our applications will become smarter to be able to create labels for us. And you'll see that the relationships matter in that case. But because we're writing our forms by hand, there wouldn't be a difference if you took out the label tag.
Okay.
I think I'm just trying to, the label tag is kind of created for that reason.
Yes, sure.
So I'm just trying to use it, but there would be no visible difference to the user if you didn't have these labels there. And I think even either. Okay, so again, I put a binding pry instead of the controller. Let's see, add a new spell to your spell book.
Petronium.
Expecto Patronum, is that what you said? Did you say that? Who said that?
That was me.
Attacks or protects from Dementors. Okay, so make a spell. We'll have entered my price session. Sweet. So our form worked. Just to review again, when we open up our form tag, it says, which URL do you want me to send this information to, and which HTTP method do you want me to use when sending it? We specified that the form kind of by default uses post, and as I mentioned yesterday, and as we'll see later today, HTML only really knows how to send forms to get from post ways, and to use the other conventional RESTful routing verbs, we'll have to kind of use a hack, which I'll show you in a second. So it hit what we expected, the post HTTP verb at the spell's URI. Where does all of our information come through? In a hash called params. Oops, what did I do? There we go. I don't know how that happened. But we spare that if we simply type in the word params, we have access to a hash that has a key value pair. So in theory, if I wanted to create a new instance of a spell, I could say spell.new, and I could pass in, I could say description here is descriptive, right? And then I could also say name is params name. All right, this is all well and good, but we should be a little bit familiar with the concept called mass assignment right now, right? We understand that this is a hash. Ruby does a lot of the, syntactic sugar by taking up these kind of initial brackets for us. But this is, at the end of the day, a hash value pairs, and we can essentially pass in a hash here, right, to assign all of the objects that we want. I guess I'll just use this as an example to show you very quickly in the terminal. Right, so I just said spell.new and I passed in these things. I wrote out the columns, the attributes in a longer format. Why not the create method? Because I don't want to create it just yet, Lucy. We'll create it eventually. I just want to use the new for now so that I don't make a permanent instance. All right, so I want to go back and show you what nesting does. So remember that we're making an instance of a spell here, right? And we know that both of these bits of information are going to pertain to the spell that we want to create. Spell/new and protects from adventurers. Okay, so now if I click make a spell, and I again return to my spells controller. I had namespace set just to show you, but then I brought it back to show you what it was without namespacing. It was just, I was like, this is what namespacing looks like, but I'm going to go back to doing it the old-fashioned way, and we'll revisit this topic in a second. Okay, so we're in our binding .pry. Again, if you look at params, we see that params now is nested. I have a key in params called spell, and that has its own hash, right? So now, if I want to create a new spell, I can just pass in params spell, and it does what's called mass assignment for me, right? It takes the key value pairs inside of the hash, and it assigns them to the attributes and assigns their values. So whenever you're creating, I see a lot of students doing this. It's fine to do it the other way, but it's really important to know what mass assignment is, and it's important to know that you can namespace your spell not in params. I guess that's true. I guess we could do that. But as you'll see later, actually in the next view that we'll do with edit, you'll see that sometimes params holds information that doesn't pertain to the instance that we're trying to make, and therefore it's important to nest them. But in the case of create, we could get away with it. Once we get into Rails, this would not be possible because params hold a lot of information. In Sinatra right now, params doesn't hold very much. Okay. Alrighty. So, in general, let's see. Who was it that said it? Lucy had said, why don't we just use create? I could just say spell.create and then pass in params spell here. I want you all to get kind of in the habit, of understanding the steps to saving something. Although we haven't quite gotten to this concept of validations yet, later on in your application, I guess you can do it either way for now, but making you aware of in the future, we're going to add something called validations, right? People, as you get pickier or care more about what information ends up in your applications, you're going to say, for example, an email can't be used more than once, or passwords should have, less than 7 or 8 characters. And in order to protect information from getting into our database that we don't want, we'll eventually add validations to our models. So what I like to do in general is to create a new instance of something using new. And then I want to test that by saying if the spell, by calling save on the spell instance that we've created a new instance of, .save is a method that will run any kind of validations that we have to make sure that our information isn't, kind of passes our rules. If spell does save, then we'll talk about this logic in a second. Otherwise, I want to send this user back to if save, and then we'll have to do else. I'll have to send the user back to the form. Right. So once we get into validations, we'll maybe say like a spell can't have the same name, right? We can't have more than one spell with the same name. So if the spell that this person tried to create does have a name and it doesn't work, we're going to say, you need to go back and try that again in the form. That didn't work correctly. However, if it does save, then we're going to say, okay, let's proceed. And then remember, in this case, we want to redirect the user to the instance that we just created. So I just want to leave this here for you all to kind of remember. But I will, for the sake of ease, just go ahead and use the create method. as Lucy suggested. And then once we've created the instance of the spell, we can redirect. Oh goodness. Wait, I forgot what this is. Can someone help me? Redirect to the redirect.
I don't think you want the colon there.
It's just redirect spells static / spells / and then we have to use the double bracket to interpolate. Or sorry, the double quotes. So remember, once I've successfully created the new instance of a spell, I want to redirect to that spell's show page. And I do so by interpolating the ID of the spell that we just created and appending it to the / spells URL. So, doesn't look like anything went through here, which is good. Spells / new. Expecto Patronum protects from Dementors. Let's make a spell. Great. See that I was redirected to the show page for the spell. And then again, it's always important to check your logs in your Sinatra console. And right here, we received a post request. Let's see, where did this actually happen? Get spell / new, and then we've begun a transaction here, and then it says, here we made a post request to spells, and then we selected the spell with the ID of the instance that we just created, and then we went to that show page. Cool. Are there any questions about that?
I think you were mentioning yesterday, like redirect and redirect to. I think the main difference being like relative and absolute paths or something like that.
Yeah, we haven't touched too much on that. Relative and absolute meaning that to. Yeah, so when we say redirect, it infers the kind of principal domain, the principal URL. And then redirect to, you're saying, would require that we have a really specific HTTPS / something.com, right? Yeah, correct. So yeah, whenever you're staying within your application or staying within the same domain, you should just use redirect. The only thing that's going to change is that what comes after the initial / the initial /. Okay, so this guy says, can you give me a starter role? New instance, not from this. And so basically this guy is just able to input his information and create a new sushi, right? And then we've kind of gone through this already. It's a post request. The URI is to /sushis. In this case, the controller method with the combination of those two. And then once the sushi is successfully created, it's redirected to that civic ID. Cool. And then we pass that information to the model creates it, and now it's on the menu. We return the instance to the user. We're now looking at the spell that we just made, the piece of that information that we made. Cool. And then the user is super picky and really annoying. If you've ever worked in food service, just like the guy that you don't want to serve, he says, I wanted red roses on my rose salmon roll. That sounds really gross. And the really nice waiter who has been taught to always please the customer is like, not to worry, we can fix this for you. So what we're going to do now is kind of create a form that allows somebody to edit something, right, that they've already made or that already exists. So what would be the HTTP verb to show somebody the form to create, to make changes in an instance that they've already created?
Get, I think.
Yep, it would be a get request. That's right. And what would the URL be? If I'm making an edit to a specific instance of a
Actually, the spells ID edit.
Yep.
A specific spell.
Yeah, so Kazicho got it right. Spells /AD/edit. And notice again how we're experiencing this variable, this kind of wild card, right? This route should be able to work for any ID that exists in our database, right? Of course, later down the line, you and I can, in our application, build some sort of protection, some nets for catching if a spell doesn't exist as you types in an ID for a spell that doesn't exist, right? We should be able to say, okay, well, if we find a spell, then render the show page spell. But if we didn't find a spell, show the user a page that tells them that, hey, this spell doesn't exist, right? That's something that, as you build more elaborate applications, or catch those kinds of things, we should be thinking about, right? But in this case, we do have, we'll just kind of stick with the basic routing, right? So we're making a GET request to /spells/ the ID of whichever spell that we want to edit, and then we're editing it, right? So we can kind of take the same code here, find the spell by the params, and then what do we want to show the user? So let me catch this here.
We want to show the user the form to edit.
Right, so we're going to show them an edit form. Great job. Okay, so let's create this edit form really quickly. Edit.here. And then I will say that we're going to look at it here. /edit. Cool.
Chris,
the only real difference. Go ahead.
You kind of touched on this the other day, and if you want to come back to this is okay. But I'm curious, I know you can. There's find by ID, and find by. When would you suggest using one versus the other?
Let's see. When would I suggest using one over the other? Well, if we were searching, let's say that you wanted to add a feature in your application where you searched for spells by their name, right? So if we had a form that allowed a user to submit a name to search for a spell by, then I would use the find by. And then find by also accepts a hash, and the key to the hash needs to be the name of the column, right? The name of the attribute that we're looking for, and then the argument would be, whatever the user had input. Again, for the purposes of this, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, I think I maybe asked that wrong. And maybe I even do this wrong, but when you're dealing with ID, is it better to do find by ID?
I don't know. I've never done that.
And maybe I approach it.
How do you do it?
I was gonna say maybe I approach it wrong, but find always throws
okay.
an error if it doesn't find the thing. But both find by and find by ID return nil if it doesn't find the thing. So if you want to add in logic that's like if it didn't find it, it's better to use find by ID. But
okay, cool.
If you use this way, you can do like a begin and a rescue for the error message. So they're
totally.
Both ways are approachable.
Cool. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Right. So what Jen is saying is that find doesn't find anything, but if we say find by ID, it can it'll just return nil if it doesn't find anything. And if the instance variable or wherever we're saving the result to does end up being nil, then we can add some other logic. Thanks, Jen.
No problem. I just have found
today.
People stuck on that issue for a while of like, why can't I get past this error? So
cool. Sweet. Okay, yeah. So that's really important to know, especially when we're thinking about this kind of logic here. Or if we were applying that to something else. If there is a spell, if spell, meaning if the spell even exists. Okay, so we'll find the spell, and then the reason why we have the spell here, it's saved in an instance variable, is because although our new and our edit forms are very similar, can basically copy and paste this over. Edit, and then I can interpolate here, or use to say spell.name. Right, when I do this, so for instance, if I go to spell/4/edit, I want to see normally what I had put in already, right? Like, in general, I should be able to, see what I had put in and make small changes to that. I shouldn't have to write everything from scratch. So if we want to be able to do this, we can take that initial value parameter, or I'm forgetting what these are called, of our form, and fill it in now with information from that instance that we have in our controller that's being passed to this view. So, cool. So now we can see that if I go to any of these, oops, spell that video. Undefined method name for nil. Oh, I'm missing a. Let's see if I'm missing. Undefined method name for nil class. Why?
I don't think you have a
spell?
third
I don't
spell.
have it. Yeah, I got rid of it, of course. So that's what the bet of having that. I forgot that I created an instance and then I deleted it. So if I had something in here, I would have prevented that error. Cool. So if I look at the other tools that I have, then they will automatically be filled in. There's one other big difference that is that between our new and our edit form. And like I had said before, forms only know how to send post and get methods, or accept post and get methods. But we want to use one of the methods, one of the HTTP verbs from the RESTful routing convention, right? Does anyone know which or what the process is for moving forward? How do we alter the form in such a way that once it reaches a controller, our controller understands this is what we have to do. This is what the user really wants. We're straying a little bit away from the convention of how HTML does it. We're using our RESTful routing conventions. We need to implement something. Has anyone gotten to the curriculum where they can explain a little bit maybe how we achieve that? Right. Okay, cool. So Lucy and Ethelbert have mentioned two things. The first thing that we need to do is activate something called rack method override. And this is something called middleware. Middleware, a kind of catch-all definition of middleware is just code that we apply to our application that intercepts a specific process. So in this case, the middleware that we're going to use for rack intercepts the process at the point in which the request is received by our server, the backend part of our application. And I believe we do this here by just saying use rack method override. Is it spelled like this? I feel like this information is inside of this README. Yep, use rack method override. Okay, sweet. And then thank you. 2 R's. And then the second thing that we need to do is also create or put this hidden input field inside of our form. So we're going to put an input field here. We're going to say that type is hidden. And we're going to say the name is underscore method. And the value is going to be the name of the that I want to use. So we'll do patch here. That's patch one that I want to use.
On the form action for the edit, don't you need the spells ID, like the spells and then spells ID?
Yes. Thank you. Great. So, right, our route where we're sending this request to has also changed. We're no longer just making this request. We're no longer sending this information to spells. We're now sending it specifically to the route of this particular spell. So we need to append the ID of the spell at the end here. Great. So again, to kind of repeat, what we had just said, the form is now submitting this information to a specific, the URL for the specific spell. We need to activate what is called the Rack middleware's override feature inside of our config.ru file. And what this does is it basically says, hey, every time you get a request coming through, check to see if the params has a key of underscore method. And if it does have a key of underscore method, it probably means that we don't want this to actually be a post request. The user wants to use an HTTP verb that is part of the RESTful routing conventions, put, patch, or delete, right? And then it says, so go look inside, see if that key exists, and if it does, rewrite to the method and controller that corresponds with this route and with this specific HTTP verb. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We ultimately want this information to end up at put slash spells slash ID, right? And then our logic will go here. Once again, we're going to need to find our spell. Well, let's just put a binding depth right here and make sure that we've landed in the right spot. So if I go to my spellcaster and I edit this spell, and I want Lumos to have, like, I don't know, an accent over it. Lumos. Or maybe it should be Guardian Leviosa. There we go. And then if I click, and of course I don't want to edit. I don't want to say make spell. I want it to be edit spell now. So a few small changes. Leviosa. And I click edit spell. Let's see if this works. Perfect. So our method for it worked. To answer Lucy's question from earlier, if we look inside of params now, we have this underscore method put, and this is not relevant to anything that we need to make the spell, right? So passing in the params alone would not have worked here because params now holds information that is irrelevant to the spell, right? But we see that what the middleware had done was that it said, is there a key of underscore method in the params? And if so, use this HTTP verb instead rather than post. Because again, HTML forms can only send information using get and post methods. Okay? Super, 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 super important to know. I always go in on people on this particular topic during our project reviews. So make sure you understand what rack method override is doing, why we need to use the underscore method, and that HTML forms only can send information in get and post requests. What we can do here is once we find the spell that we want to use, we can just say spell.update and pass in params spell. and our changes have been made. So instead of my controller action, I will go ahead and say spell. One thing that you'll notice here is that remember that instance variables are only reserved for information that we need to pass to the view. If you don't need to pass information to the view, you don't need to really use an instance variable. I guess we would, well, again, this is something that you'll catch on with later. If something is incorrect, we would want to re-render the view again, but we would want to re-render it with the information you put in. So we would keep an instance variable. That's kind of besides the point. The takeaway is if you ever need information that the controller, that needs to be communicated from the controller to the view, always use the instance variable, right? Okay. So I'll say spell.update, and then I'll just pass in all the params. Params spell. And then once we've updated this correctly, again, what do I want to do? What do I want to do once I've updated the spell?
Redirect to the updated spell.
Exactly. We want to redirect it to the updated spell. So I'll just take the same URL that I used before, and I change this to an instance variable now. I don't know which way. I don't know what the best way to show you guys is. I'll just do it like this. All right. So let's see. Let's exit out of this price session. I'll go to spells 4. I'll edit it. And expected patronum needs to have an exclamation point at the end. We'll click edit spell. We'll be redirected to spell with the changes. Cool. Are there any questions about our put request? We've got one more. Got 5 minutes to do it.
I guess so. Like while we're building, really, we just want to have the main views that we want accessible, and then after the fact, sort of connect them instead of like A tags or whatever redirects we need.
I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
So I guess while we're setting up our pages, we want essentially the views that the user is going to be using most, and then after the fact is when we would kind of set up like a menu bar or some type of like navigation system for them.
Yeah. I see what you mean. I think there's a little bit more information about that inside of the curriculum. You'll see here that there's like a layout file here, and there's a yield, and there's a lesson about this. But essentially, this is the HTML that all of your views are being rendered in. So this is what I believe it's called this in Sinatra as well. It's called a partial. We can basically, if we use our element inspector to look at this application or to look at this page, we're looking at a specific spells ID page, but you can see that in the HTML that's being rendered, we have all of this information from the head inside of this file as well. So basically the way our Sinatra application is working is it's just taking all of the views that we want, or that are, of course, based on the controller and the route, and it's rendering them here. So any information that you want kind of consistent on every page, you can just kind of put in the layout. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So the last bit that we'll need is just to add this delete, and we'll just put the delete button on our edit form. So underneath edit spell, we'll just have delete. And this is super simple as well. We're creating another form. It's separate from the form above. And the action is going to be the same action as the route that we had indicated above. And of course, We can't really help the method being post, so we'll just leave that there. We're going to need our input tag in, and it's just going to be delete now. And then we just need the input to submit the form, and the value is just going to be delete this spell, right? Delete this spell. If I refresh my page, here it is. Put a break. Couple breaks here. So when we delete the spell, the information that's being passed through, obviously we're not really providing information here. There's just a button. There's no input or anything. So when we delete the spell, when we receive a request to spells/id, delete /spells/id, we are actually just using the parameter to find the spell, right? We're going to destroy the spell. And I'll send out an article about the difference between destroy and delete. One of them runs all of your relationships for you. So for example, if you're a user and you delete your profile, everything related to your profile shouldn't exist either, right? I guess that comes from dependent destroy. But there can be some verifications that you implement to prevent information from being destroyed incorrectly or leaving big gaps of data in your profile. I'm forgetting off the top of my head right now which one delete or destroy does. I'll have to review it afterwards. I believe it's delete, because I remember thinking that destroy sounded like the more kind of nefarious term for removing a bit of information, but I think delete is the one that actually does everything. I'll have to double check. And then, of course, once we've deleted the instance, there's no specific page to return to. So we just want to redirect the user to /spells. So let's give this a try. I want to delete expecto patronum. I click delete the spell, and I'm returned to the index page for all of the spells. Of course, if I look at the route or my logs, I can see the SQL that executed inside of my database. Sweet. All right. Any questions in the last minute? The last thing that I wanted to show you was that Corneal Corneal has a very special method. I might regret showing this to you later. Please do not rely on this. You should be able to do this on your own. But Corneal does have this feature where you say scaffold, and then you type in the name of a model. So let's say this would be wizards. And it creates all of your views for you. Oh, I guess it doesn't do everything. I thought it did. Well, I guess maybe it would have checked from the database if there had been one. It creates your controller for you with all of your routes. I guess it does allow you to fill in the logic. Okay, so this one isn't as bad as the Rails one. But again, be aware that this does this for you if you want to just do something really quickly, but always remember that you should be able to do everything from scratch. So always read the READMEs and see what kinds of fun features your gems have. And if this seems powerful, again, moving forward, as we dive into Rails in the next section, there will kind of even be more magic. So it's important to really make sure that Sinatra was, I believe Sinatra was created after Rails as kind of meant to be a step down for there to be more configurability. And it's really important to just make sure that, especially in this section, you're following all of the information and you're understanding what is my controller doing, how are my methods of my controller working, what is rack method override doing, do I understand forms and nesting parameters, because all of this stuff just only becomes more abstract. Great. That's basically it for CRUD and Sinatra. Go ahead.
There's just one thing. I don't know how far you guys go into this and things like that, but about the validations that the user might only be able to delete their own spell or something that is the one that they created, or they can edit only the one that they created or something like this. Mm-hmm. Are you going to go into this later, or you guys?
That'll have to be left up to the curriculum. We'll talk about authentication later for users, and then. So you're right. There are kind of two ways that you could do this. You could write a custom validation in your model that says, can only be deleted if. That might be kind of tricky. You would need to create something. The way that we would kind of generally do that is inside of the controller, we would have a helper method that says something like, we would find the spell, and then you'll learn about current user later. Current user determines who the current user is. And you can say, if spell dot user ID equals current user ID, then go ahead and delete the spell. But otherwise, say that this action is not covered.
Okay, and this will be the methods for this thing will be inside. They will be helper methods inside the application controllers. Yes, to define if the user's logged in, if the current user.
Well, you'll be coding all of that yourself. And that'll be in the next lecture. The other thing that you can do is inside of the README, of course. Inside of the form, you just use an ERB tag to say, if spell dot user ID equals current user ID, and then you can conditionally render this delete form, right?
Okay.
So there are several places in which you can kind of put up a wall saying, no, you cannot continue, right?
Okay. It's because I've done this already, so I would just because you didn't explain today and things like this, I just wanted to recap what I had, and I did on the application controller the part,
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah,
if you're going to be on the next lecture, it's fine. Or if you can just, talk about the next lecture or something like this, just quickly, it's okay.
Yeah. This will definitely be touched on in the next lecture.
Okay, perfect then.